VANISH 3 by Barron Darby. Chapter 21. Lucy. The Tuesday after the flight. Drew had sent us back to work after our meeting in his office, but the word work had lost all meaning the moment we stepped out into the hallway. The newsroom, usually alive with chatter, clacking keyboards, and the soft hum of monitors felt strangely hollow, as if the air itself had thinned. I sat down at my desk out of habit more than purpose, staring at the glowing screen while my mind refused to settle on anything resembling productivity. Instead of uploading videos or checking analytics, I found myself typing frantic search queries, digging through stories about stolen phones, missing persons, and cases that spiraled into something far worse. Each link I found, each headline that hinted at something sinister, I sent to Thomas and Nora, as if collecting fragments of someone else's nightmare might help us make sense of our own. The usual rhythm of our responsibilities had unraveled completely, replaced by a quiet, persistent dread that pressed against my chest. Our website, once filled with bright, engaging content meant to entertain viewers across Madison, Wisconsin, now sat neglected, its purpose forgotten in the face of something far more urgent. I imagined someone clicking onto our page, expecting light-hearted videos, only to find outdated posts and silence, and the thought felt absurdly disconnected from the reality we were living in. There was no room left for cheerful distractions or polished uploads, not when Steph's name lingered in every conversation and every unspoken thought. The cursor blinked on my screen, waiting for input I couldn't give, as my attention drifted back to the same questions over and over again. A sudden ping broke through the stillness, sharp and insistent enough to make my shoulders tense. Drew had summoned us back to his office, and the three of us didn't hesitate for even a second. Chairs scraped against the floor as we stood, our movements quick and slightly unsteady, as if urgency had replaced coordination. We moved down the hallway together, not speaking, our footsteps echoing, louder than usual in the narrow space. The closer we got, the heavier the atmosphere seemed to feel, like walking toward something we weren't ready to face but couldn't avoid. When we stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the man sitting in the chair across from Drew's desk. He didn't belong in this space, not in the way a polished professional or a composed investigator might. For a brief moment, my mind tried to place him in that role, but the illusion fell apart almost instantly. His hair was unkempt, sticking out in uneven directions as if he had been running his hands through it for hours, and his eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with exhaustion and something deeper, something unsettled. He wore a simple sweatshirt and jeans, the kind of clothes that suggested he hadn't thought about appearance at all. And the longer I looked at him, the more a quiet unease settled into my chest. "Tim, this is Dennis, Steph's neighbor," Drew said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent that made me straighten in my seat. He gestured for us to sit, and I obeyed without thinking, lowering myself into the chair with a stiffness I couldn't shake. A slow, creeping dread began to build, the kind that starts as a faint whisper and grows louder with every passing second. I glanced at Nora, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but her expression mirrored my own unease, her eyes fixed on Dennis with a guarded intensity. The question hung unspoken between us, heavy and persistent. Had he come here with bad news? We settled into our chairs, the movement quiet but deliberate, and turned our attention fully to Dennis. He looked back at us with a mixture of urgency and exhaustion, as if he had been carrying this moment with him for hours and was finally ready to release it. Drew leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk, and broke the silence. "Okay," he said, his tone measured. "Time to compare notes. Dennis is going to tell us what he knows, and we'll share what we have." The simplicity of his words did little to ease the tension, and I felt my pulse quicken as Dennis reached into his pocket. He pulled out his phone and began passing it around, his fingers trembling just enough to be noticeable. As the device moved from one set of hands to another, he spoke, his voice uneven but determined, explaining how Steph had told him about meeting someone new. There had been excitement in her messages, he said, a kind of brightness that stood out even through text, and she had shared pictures, snippets of her experience, and even a voice memo from Atlanta. I listened closely, trying to picture her in those moments, trying to reconcile the version of her he described with the silence we were now facing. But then his tone shifted, growing darker, and the room seemed to tighten around us as he described how things had taken a turn. He told us about calling 911, about the urgency that had driven him to act when something felt wrong, and about the follow-up call from dispatch as he was on his way to Channel 3. They had checked the address he provided, he said, but found nothing out of place, no signs of distress, no indication that anything was wrong. The words felt hollow, like a reassurance that didn't quite hold up under scrutiny. When he reached the parking lot, he had texted Steph again, one last attempt to reach her, but there had been no response. As he spoke, I felt a quiet frustration building, the kind that comes from knowing something isn't right, but having no proof to show for it. Thomas was the next to respond, pulling out his own phone and showing us the messages he had received. Steph had written about needing time off, about rescheduling meetings, about stepping away in a way that felt too abrupt to be normal. He played the voice memo, and the sound of her voice filled the room, familiar and distant at the same time. I watched Dennis's reaction as he listened, searching for any sign of recognition or concern, but his expression remained fixed, tense, and unreadable. When it was my turn, I hesitated for a brief moment before taking out my phone, aware that what I was about to share would only deepen the unease already present. I explained the messages I had received, the strange references, the names that didn't quite make sense, and the patterns that had begun to emerge. There was something deliberate about it all, something that suggested manipulation rather than coincidence, and as I spoke, I could see the realization settling over the others. The idea that someone had fallen into a trap, that Steph might be caught in something far more complicated than we initially thought, hung heavily in the air. When I finished, the room fell into a brief silence, the kind that follows when everyone is trying to process too much at once. "What's next?" Nora asked, her voice cutting through the stillness with a quiet urgency. "What can we do?" Her question felt like the one we had all been circling, the one that had no easy answer. Dennis leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together as if holding himself steady. He said he was thinking about getting on a plane to Atlanta the next day, taking the earliest flight he could find. Being this far away was unbearable, he admitted, and the idea of doing nothing was worse than any uncertainty he might face by going there. At least in Atlanta, he said, he could. Keep an eye on the condo, watch for any signs of activity, try to piece together what might be happening. His determination was palpable, cutting through the fog of indecision that had settled over the rest of us. Drew nodded slowly, absorbing the plan, before adding that he would reach out to Steph's family that night. Her sister and her son deserved to know what we knew, he said, and there was a chance they might have information we didn't. The mention of her family brought a new layer of gravity to the situation, reminding us that this wasn't just a puzzle to solve, but a life that mattered deeply to others. We all nodded in agreement, though the gesture felt more like an acknowledgement of reality than a sign of confidence. The room grew quiet again, each of us retreating into our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we had just heard. I couldn't stop thinking about Dennis's plan, about the image of him arriving in Atlanta, standing outside that condo, searching for answers in a place that might hold none. There was something undeniably proactive about it, something that contrasted sharply with our current state of waiting and wondering. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something close to hope, quickly overshadowed by the uncertainty that followed. Thomas stared down at the floor, his usual composure replaced by a stillness that felt heavy and uncharacteristic. Drew leaned back in his chair, one hand moving absently to his mustache as he looked up at the ceiling, as if searching for clarity in the blank space above him. Nora sat with her hands near her face, her fingers brushing against her lips in a nervous habit she couldn't seem to break. I felt my leg begin to bounce uncontrollably, the movement subtle but persistent, while Dennis twisted his hands together, the tension in his body impossible to ignore. The silence stretched on, lingering longer than any of us expected, until it became almost tangible, pressing against us from all sides. It felt like time had slowed, each second passing with a weight that made it hard to breathe. Finally, Drew exhaled and straightened slightly, bringing us back to the present. "Okay," he said, his voice quieter now but still firm. "Everyone can go for now. We'll be in touch." The words signaled an end to the meeting, but they did little to provide any sense of closure. We stood slowly, one by one, the movement almost mechanical, and made our way toward the door. No one spoke as we filed out, our footsteps soft against the floor, our expressions distant and unfocused. The hallway outside felt colder than before, the air carrying a quiet tension that refused to dissipate. As we walked back to our desks, it felt less like returning to work and more like drifting through the aftermath of something we didn't fully understand. The normal world continued around us, unchanged and indifferent, while we moved through it like survivors of a storm that hadn't quite passed. Chapter 22. Dennis. 1 week after the flight. I booked the 6:30 a.m. flight without hesitation, the confirmation email barely finishing its load before I was already moving through my apartment like someone being chased. There was no method to what I packed, only urgency, as clothes, chargers, and whatever my hands could grab disappeared into a faded, hippie-inspired duffel bag I had picked up years ago in a crowded market in Ecuador. The bag still carried the faint scent of incense and sun-warmed fabric, a memory of a calmer time that felt impossibly distant now. I left for the airport 4 hours early, not because I needed to, but because staying still had become unbearable, as if the walls themselves were pressing in with every unanswered question. Sleep had never even entered the conversation, not for a second, and my body buzzed with a restless energy that refused to settle. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind filled the darkness with possibilities I didn't want to consider, each one worse than the last. Drew's wife, Lisa, had offered to watch both animals without hesitation, her voice steady and kind in a way that almost made me break. I crossed into the other side of the townhouse to get Lenny, finding him curled up in his usual spot, blissfully unaware of the storm unfolding around him. I scooped him up gently, bringing along his favorite worn pillow, and placed him beside the other cats so at least they would have each other while everything else felt uncertain. That small act, simple as it was, gave me something fragile to hold on to, a thread of normalcy in the middle of chaos. I pictured Lizzie and me back on the couch, legs tangled, a bottle of champagne sweating on the table as we sang badly and loudly to My Fair Lady, laughing at nothing and everything. The image felt so vivid that for a moment I almost believed it was just a matter of time before we returned to it. But the weight in my chest refused to lift, a quiet reminder that hope and reality were not always on the same page. I grabbed my keys, slung the duffel over my shoulder, and stepped out into the early morning darkness, the air cool and still against my skin. The airport was already alive when I arrived, fluorescent lights casting a pale glow over travelers moving with purpose. I checked in quickly, barely registering the interaction, and made my way to the gate long before boarding was anywhere near beginning. There, I paced in slow, uneven loops, my footsteps blending into the low murmur of conversations and the distant echo of rolling luggage. My eyes kept drifting toward the only coffee shop in sight, its metal gate still pulled down, as if it held some kind of answer behind it. When it finally opened at 5, I was there within seconds, ordering without thinking, more out of habit than hunger. It struck me then, suddenly and sharply, that I hadn't eaten in over 24 hours, the realization landing with a dull, hollow sensation in my stomach. The thought of food felt foreign, almost intrusive, but I forced myself to buy a muffin, adding coffee as if the routine might ground me. I sat down with both in front of me, staring at them for a moment before taking a bite, the texture dry and unappealing in a way that made my throat tighten. 2 sips of coffee followed, bitter and hot, but neither did anything to settle the unease swirling inside. Me. Within minutes, I threw both away, the act oddly final, as if I had just confirmed that normal instincts no longer applied. As boarding approached, the gate area began to fill, voices overlapping and rising, but I remained detached, watching it all as if from a distance. Just as I stood to gather my things, a voice cut through the noise, calling my name with urgency that made me turn immediately. Lucy, one of Steph's co-workers, was walking quickly toward me, her pace brisk and determined, her expression set in a way that told me she had made a decision she wasn't going to question. She stopped in front of me, slightly out of breath, and said she had decided to come with me, that she had bought her ticket at 3 a.m. without telling anyone. For a moment I just stared at her, surprised and strangely relieved all at once. Lucy. Wow, I managed, the words coming out softer than I expected. A rush of gratitude and something close to affection moved through me, surprising in its intensity given how little I really knew her. But in that moment, she didn't feel like a stranger at all. Not when she was standing there with the same urgency, the same need to understand, the same unwillingness to sit still and wait. She nodded, brushing a strand of hair back from her face, and told me she had new information from Lizzie's sister. The words tightened something inside. Me. And I followed her to a pair of empty seats in the boarding area without hesitation. She sat down, and leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if the details required a certain level of privacy. Drew had texted her, she explained, after speaking with Steph's sister, who had in turn spoken with her son, Andre. Andre had used Find My iPhone, tracking the last known location, and the result had been both a breakthrough and a new source of dread. The phone had pinged at the same address Dennis had mentioned earlier, 4240 Horizon Lane, a detail that seemed to echo louder than anything else she said. I felt my hand move instinctively to my chest, pressing against the sudden tightness there, as the reality of that information settled in. "Oh, dear God," I whispered, the words barely audible even to myself. Lucy's expression didn't waver, her focus sharp, her energy directed forward rather than inward. She said that would be our first stop once we landed, that we needed to see the place for ourselves and figure out what wasn't being said. Then, almost seamlessly, she shifted gears, suggesting we try to sit together on the plane so we could go over everything in detail. Her mind worked in patterns, she explained, in timelines and structures, and she wanted to map out every piece of information we had, every message, every gap. I nodded, grateful for her clarity even as my own thoughts continued to spiral. When she asked if I had anything new, I shook my head, the motion heavy with frustration. I told her there had been no response, not to the dozens, maybe hundreds of messages I had sent, each one growing more desperate than the last. That was what scared me the most, I admitted, the silence that had replaced her voice so completely. If she was there, if she was safe, why wouldn't she answer? Lucy didn't respond immediately, her gaze dropping for a moment as she considered the possibilities. Then she said quietly that maybe she wasn't there, not in the way we were imagining. The idea landed hard, and before I could stop myself, I voiced the thought that had been circling in the back of my mind. What if he had her somewhere else, somewhere hidden, somewhere the police wouldn't think to look? The image that followed sent a shudder through my entire body, cold and involuntary. "If she's anywhere near that house," Lucy said, her voice firm, "we'll find her." There was a certainty in her tone that I couldn't quite match, but I wanted to believe it anyway. I studied her for a moment, taking in the steadiness of her posture, the way she seemed to anchor herself in action rather than fear. It was something I hadn't been able to do, not yet, and I found myself leaning into her confidence like it might hold me up. "Let's just get there," she added, and I nodded again, the words settling into me like a quiet promise. On the plane, we managed to convince a young man with oversized headphones and a carefully curated outfit to switch seats, his mild annoyance quickly replaced by indifference as he moved away. Lucy slid into the seat beside me, already pulling out her laptop before we had even reached cruising altitude. The moment the seat belt sign turned off, she flipped it open on the tray table, her fingers moving quickly across the keys. She explained that she wanted to build a timeline, something precise and comprehensive, to see if anything stood out once it was all laid out. I watched as lines of text began to form on the screen, each entry a piece of a story we didn't yet understand. She started with Thursday, noting that Lizzie had posted a picture from a news coverage summit, her life appearing completely normal from the outside. Friday followed, with my message to her, a simple photo of Lenny sitting in a chair, licking his paw, a moment that now felt painfully distant. That was when she mentioned meeting someone, Lucy said, her voice steady as she read, and when the plan to go to Atlanta first appeared, Saturday brought confirmation that they were at the airport, a detail that seemed harmless at the time but now carried a different weight. Sunday was quieter, marked by a message that he wanted to stay in all day, to get to know each other, a phrase that felt innocuous until it didn't. Monday unraveled quickly, Lucy continued, her voice maintaining its rhythm even as the content grew more unsettling. There were messages to Thomas about canceling meetings, responses that grew sharp and out of character, and a voice memo that left more questions than answers. Then came the photos, the locations, the small details that painted a picture of movement and presence, while somehow still feeling incomplete. Lucy paused only briefly before continuing, noting how Lizzie had asked her to reschedule a meeting, and then responded with an edge that didn't match who she was. By Monday night, something had changed, a hint of fear slipping into her messages, subtle but undeniable. Tuesday escalated quickly, with references that didn't make sense, mentions of a brother who didn't exist, followed by a message that cut through everything else. She said he was going to kill her, Lucy read, her voice quieter now, and then there was nothing. The silence that followed that message seemed to stretch across the entire timeline, filling the space where answers should have been. Dennis's 911 call, the police response that found nothing, and then Wednesday, when her phone pinged at the house on Horizon Lane. Lucy leaned back slightly, her eyes scanning the screen as if searching for something she might have missed. The entire sequence felt unreal, like a story that didn't quite connect, each piece raising more questions than it answered. As I stared at the timeline, another thought surfaced, one I hadn't fully allowed myself to consider until now. I remembered a conversation, something Lizzie had said in a moment that had seemed almost hypothetical at the time. She had talked about what she would be willing to endure to get her son back on her side, the lengths she might go to prove something, to make a point. The idea felt distant then, almost abstract, but now it came back with a clarity that made my stomach tighten. Could this be something else entirely? Something we were misreading from the start? I turned my head slightly, glancing at Lucy, wondering if I should share the thought, if it even made sense outside of my own mind. The possibility that this was a staged situation, that Trent was playing a role in something orchestrated rather than something dangerous, lingered uncomfortably. But it also felt too personal, too complicated, something that belonged to a different layer of Lizzie's life that Lucy might not understand. I looked out the window instead, the clouds stretching endlessly beneath us, soft and distant, offering no answers. The thought lingered anyway, persistent and unsettling, raising questions I wasn't ready to voice. For the first time, I wondered if I wasn't just chasing answers, but being led somewhere I didn't yet understand. Chapter 23. Dennis. 1 week after the flight, we landed beneath a pale Atlanta sky and moved through the terminal with the numb, hollow energy of people running on fear instead of sleep. The airport seemed too bright, too polished, too alive for the kind of dread we carried, with glossy floors reflecting streams of travelers and the constant murmur of arrivals folding into the metallic announcements overhead. Lucy walked beside me with her phone in one hand and her bag slung over her shoulder, her pace brisk, practical, while I followed the signs to ground transportation, as though my body had memorized the steps before my mind could catch up. I opened the Uber app, typed in the address that had already begun to feel cursed, 4240 Horizon Lane, and stared at it on the screen until the letters blurred together. From the airport, a fact that should have been comforting but somehow made everything worse. It meant Steph had been close, frighteningly close, in a place that still felt distant enough to become unreal. We waited just inside the terminal doors for the driver to arrive, the warm Georgia air slipping in each time the glass entrance opened, carrying with it the smell of exhaust, damp pavement, and jet fuel. Lucy glanced down at her phone, frowned, then stepped away when it began to ring, leaving me alone with the noise of the airport and the pounding of my own pulse. I watched her from several yards away, trying to read her face before she even turned back toward me. She listened for a long moment, one hand pressed to her ear, her shoulders going stiff in a way that made something cold begin to travel up the back of my neck. When she finally ended the call and walked toward me, her mouth opened as if words were ready, but nothing came out. That silence was worse than any sentence she might have spoken. "What?" I said, hearing the edge in my own voice before I could soften it. "Lucy, what?" She lifted one hand in a small motion, urging me to sit, and I obeyed without taking my eyes off her. I lowered myself onto a hard terminal bench, while people streamed around us, dragging wheeled suitcases, laughing into phones, reuniting in quick embraces, living inside ordinary moments that suddenly felt impossibly far from mine. Lucy remained standing for a second longer, as if she needed the extra height to keep herself together, then sat beside me and swallowed hard. "Dennis," she said at last, and her voice trembled around my name. "That was Drew. He said a GM friend of his called him. Apparently, word is spreading in the news world that a news director named Trent in Atlanta is in jail for something awful, and Drew's friend said it involves another news director, a woman." The words landed one by one, but together they struck like a blow. Lucy's eyes filled with tears, and mine answered before I could stop them, hot and immediate, blurring. The polished airport floor below us. Jail was not the language of confusion or miscommunication. Jail belonged to something heavier, darker, something that pushed far beyond my desperate theory that maybe this had all been a performance, a reckless stunt, some twisted game that Steph had agreed to and lost track of. I dropped my gaze and let the sounds of the terminal crash over me. A crying child somewhere to the left, the mechanical churn of baggage carousels beyond the wall, a bright recorded voice directing passengers to the correct claim area, and a couple a few feet away, kissing like the world had done them a favor. A moment, her voice steadier now, though I could hear the effort in it. "It's not over until it's over. I'm not believing anything until somebody proves it. And Drew's friend still doesn't know the victim's name. Let's get over to Horizon Lane." I nodded, though I barely felt my body do it, and rose in something close to a trance. Our Uber was only 2 minutes away, so we stepped outside to the pickup curb and stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder, watching cars pull up and leave in a slow parade of brake lights and hurried goodbyes. The driver who arrived was a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a clean car that smelled faintly of air freshener and old vinyl. He said very little, which felt like a mercy, and he kept the radio off, letting silence settle around us like a blanket too heavy to throw off. Atlanta moved past the windows in a blur of ramps, billboards, low commercial buildings and clean, lined neighborhoods stitched together by wide roads and thick green trees. I sat with my hands locked together so tightly my knuckles hurt, looking at my reflection in the window and barely recognizing the man staring back. As we drew closer to the address, the driver glanced in the rear-view mirror and finally spoke. "Lots of police up there," he said. "I can only get you about a block away." "That's fine," Lucy answered before I could gather a single word. I was grateful for that, grateful that she could still speak in full sentences and make practical decisions while I felt as though part of me had already gone numb. He led us out near a barricaded stretch of street where 2 squad cars blocked the road, their presence calm but absolute, and we stood beside our bags for a moment trying to absorb the scene. A cluster of neighbors lingered on the sidewalks and at the edges of manicured lawns, their voices low and urgent, their faces arranged in that eager mask people wear when tragedy has arrived close enough to be frightening and fascinating at once. The neighborhood itself was expensive in a way that tried not to brag. Modern loft-style residences stood behind trimmed hedges and ornamental grasses, their white stucco walls and dark-framed windows gleaming in the afternoon light. Luxury SUVs lined the curb in shades of black, pearl, and silver, and the flower beds looked freshly maintained, every bloom positioned as if wealth could make even nature behave. I craned my neck and thought I could just make out the top of the white building from Steph's earlier photos, and the sight of it sent a sickening wave through me. The place was real. It had walls, a roof, a driveway, a front door, and whatever had happened inside those boundaries had already changed the temperature of my life. A few feet away, 3 older women gathered near a mailbox, speaking in sharp little bursts that were meant to be private but carried anyway. One of them, silver-haired and thin as a reed, leaned in and said she'd heard he was some big shot at a local television station. Another asked if he was an anchor, her voice rising with scandalized curiosity, and the third gave a tight, eager smile before announcing that what she'd heard involved either a drug overdose or some kind of sex game gone wrong. Their words made something savage flare in me. I had to grip the handle of my duffel to keep from marching over there and tearing the gossip right out of their mouths. There was no universe in which Steph would wander into some cheap, lurid story like that. And yet, even as I rejected it, a cruel thought slipped under the door of my mind. How well do we ever really know anyone once they are alone with a stranger? Before I could sink too far into that thought, a man approached carrying a small poodle in his arms, as if he were presenting royalty. He was dressed head to toe in shades of purple, from his shirt to a flowing piece of fabric draped like a dramatic scarf, and he moved with a theatrical flourish that seemed almost impossible against the grimness of the street. "Y'all," he said in a syrupy southern drawl, "there's a press conference in about 30 minutes. They're doing it right in front of the condo, but me and Poo Poo are just going to stream it from my place." He kissed the poodle's head, took one of her paws, and wiggled it in a little wave. The dog stared at us with blank resignation, as if she had long ago given up questioning any of this. His gaze drifted down to our bags, then back up to our faces. "Y'all from out of town?" he asked, and Lucy answered yes, that we had just arrived. He widened his eyes as though that made us either noble or deeply foolish. "And you came straight here. Lord, child, Atlanta has better attractions than this. You could at least go to Centennial Olympic Park and waste your grief in a prettier place." something in me finally broke through the paralysis. "We just want to know what happened," I said, and my voice sounded rough, scraped raw from hours of silence and panic. He lifted his eyebrows. "Don't we all, sugar?" he said. "I got friends with the popo," meaning police, not poo-poo, and they told me there isn't an actual body yet, but they found enough evidence to make things ugly. Hair, blood, DNA, a phone, some other mess in the backyard. That man is in deep trouble." He wandered away after that with a cheerful blessing that felt grotesque in the moment, his purple fabric fluttering behind him as he carried the poodle back toward his condo. I watched him go and wondered if I would ever again understand what a blessed day was supposed to feel like. Lucy exhaled slowly and turned to me, saying we needed somewhere to sit and watch the press conference. One of the whispering older women overheard her and pointed us toward a coffee shop down the block called Peaches and Cream, praising the lattes and the mugs with peaches painted on the sides. The name hit me like a flash of heat. Steph had sent me that picture of the 2 lattes on the table, and suddenly I knew this had to be the place. "Let's go," I said, grabbing Lucy's arm harder than I meant to. "Now." We moved fast, almost at a run, our bags bumping against our legs as we hurried down the block and around the corner. The moment I saw the cafe through the window, I knew with a certainty that made my chest ache that we had found it. The dark brown tables, the bright ceramic mugs decorated with peaches, the light slanting through. The glass just so. It was all there, just as it had been in the photo Steph had sent, down to the angle of one particular table by the window. That table sat empty, waiting, and the sight of it made the room seem to narrow until nothing else existed. I pointed without speaking, and Lucy understood immediately. I slid into the chair Steph must have occupied, and Lucy took the seat across from me, the one that would have belonged to Trent. For several seconds, I could do nothing except run my hands along the edge of the table back and forth, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingertips as if some trace of her warmth might still be there. The cafe smelled of espresso, milk foam, sugar, and fresh pastry, and under any other circumstance, it would have felt charming, almost whimsical. Now it felt haunted. Every sound seemed sharpened, the hiss of steaming milk, the clink of ceramic against saucers, the soft chatter of customers who had no idea they were drinking coffee beside the edge of my private nightmare. Lucy took over again, rising to get us both black coffees and returning with quiet efficiency. She pulled out her laptop, found the local station's live stream, and set the computer between us on the table. It had not started yet, so we sat in silence with our untouched cups, both staring at the frozen pre-broadcast image on the screen, as if we could force the future to arrive more gently by watching hard enough. I wanted the police chief to step up and tell the city there had been a terrible misunderstanding, that no one had been hurt, that everyone involved regretted the confusion and the spectacle and could now go home. Failing that, I wanted him to name someone else entirely, a stranger whose existence would save Steph from becoming real inside this story. Instead, after several brutal minutes, a broad-shouldered black man in glasses and a police chief's hat approached a makeshift podium crowded with microphones. He cleared his throat, glanced down once, and said, "Good afternoon. I'm Chief Newman of the Atlanta Police Department. I will share the information that I can, but this is an active investigation, and I will not be taking questions. His voice carried the flat finality of someone used to stepping into chaos without blinking. He said officers had been dispatched overnight to the residence behind him for a welfare check after an individual called 911 asking for help. They entered the home, found enough evidence to arrest Trent J. McCarthy, age 52, employed at NBC6 on suspicion of 2 homicides, and would not yet be releasing the names of the victims. For a second after he finished, the world remained eerily still, as if the cafe itself had taken in a breath and forgotten how to let it out. Then reporters began shouting over one another. Was Trent McCarthy married? Had bodies been found? What evidence had led to the arrest? Chief Newman half-turned, gave them a look sharp enough to cut glass, and repeated that there would be no questions before walking away from the microphones. The stream continued for a few empty seconds, the podium now abandoned, the crime scene tape behind it moving lightly in the breeze. Lucy closed the laptop with slow, careful hands. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us said a word because language had suddenly become too small for what had settled between us. No name had been spoken, not once, and still we knew the way. People know a storm is directly above them before the first drop falls, by the pressure in the air, by the silence in the birds, by something ancient and immediate in the body that does not wait for official confirmation. I bent forward and buried my face in my hands, the wood edge of the table pressing against my forearms, and all I could think was that even if Steph had stepped into this willingly at the beginning, even if she had imagined she was acting out some elaborate scheme for reasons only she could justify, it had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. Chapter 24. Thomas. 1 week. After the flight, none of us could work after the Atlanta police chief held his press conference, not in any way that resembled the sharp, fast-paced rhythm we were known for. The newsroom, once alive with overlapping conversations, ringing phones, and the constant churn of breaking stories, had gone strangely muted, as though someone had turned down the volume on an entire world. People sat at their desks staring at screens that no longer held their attention, their fingers hovering over keyboards without ever committing to a single keystroke. Hell, we could barely function, each of us trapped inside our own thoughts, replaying what we had just seen and heard, searching for any crack in it that might prove it wasn't real. I still had to be in charge, though, and the weight of that responsibility pressed against me, even as everything inside felt like it was unraveling. I gathered what focus I could and told everyone to strip the day down to its essentials, to operate in bare-bones mode until we could think clearly again. Only the most critical stories in Madison would get coverage, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady, while everything else would be filled with national content pulled from the feeds. There was always plenty of that, an endless stream of events unfolding across the country that we could lean on when local coverage faltered. Normally, it was a safety net we used without thinking, but now it felt like a thin veil barely hiding the truth sitting right in front of us. The irony was impossible to ignore, because the biggest national story at that moment was the very one we were trying to process. A news director in Atlanta had been arrested for what was being described as a possible double murder, and every network, every feed, every update seemed to circle back to that same headline. The story had already begun to spread, gaining traction with each passing minute, pulling in speculation, commentary, and the kind of attention that turned tragedy into spectacle. I could feel the tension in the room every time someone's screen refreshed or a new alert chimed softly in the background. It was as if the entire country had locked onto the same frequency, and we were sitting at the center of it, unable to look away. Lucy was out for the day, her absence noted in the quietest ways at first, then in whispers that grew louder as the hours passed. Bernie, our receptionist, had already started talking, sharing with a few people that she believed Lucy had gone to Atlanta, her voice carrying just enough curiosity to invite questions. In a place like ours, information didn't stay contained for long, and it moved quickly, slipping from one person to the next until it became something larger than its original form. People began to connect dots, some cautiously, others with a kind of eager certainty that made my stomach tighten. By midday, the entire newsroom was aware that something was wrong with Steph, even if no one had all the details. We moved through the day like machines running on faulty wiring, going through motions without any real connection to them. Conversations happened in hushed tones, fragments of speculation and concern exchanged in corners, near desks, by the coffee machine, always just out of earshot but never completely hidden. Every glance carried a question, every pause stretched a little too long, and the usual confidence that came with being journalists had turned into something sharper, more restless. We were not the kind of people who let things pass without digging, without asking, without pushing until something gave. And the industry itself was small enough that word traveled fast, faster than anyone could contain it, moving through networks of contacts, texts, and calls that connected us all whether we wanted it or not. By the time the afternoon rolled into early evening, the tension had settled into something almost tangible, a presence that lingered in the air between us. At 6 p.m. Eastern Time, word came through that Atlanta police would be holding another press conference, and the timing couldn't have been worse for us. It was 5 o'clock our time, the start of our evening news, when the anchors needed to be on set. The director and producer locked into the booth, and every second accounted for. But even with those responsibilities, there was no stopping the pull of what was about to happen. The anchors took their places under the studio lights, their expressions composed, their voices steady as they moved through the opening segments, delivering the news with a professionalism that had been drilled into them over years. Behind the scenes, the director and producer managed the flow, calling shots, adjusting timing, keeping everything running as it should. But the rest of us gathered around Nora's computer, drawn together by the need to see, to hear, to understand what would come next. Even those who couldn't step away completely found ways to check their phones, sneaking quick glances whenever they could, their attention divided between the broadcast we were producing and the one unfolding hundreds of miles away. The live stream flickered onto the screen, the image sharpening into focus as the familiar figure of Chief Newman stepped into view. He stood behind a cluster of microphones, his posture firm, his presence steady, the badge on his chest catching the light in a way that made it impossible to ignore. There was something in his expression, a weight that hadn't been there before. Or maybe we were just seeing it more clearly now. He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice measured, each word deliberate as it carried through the speakers and into the silence around us. "Good evening," he said, introducing himself again, though none of us needed the reminder. He explained that he was there to provide an update on what he described as an unfortunate tragedy, the words landing with a heaviness that made my chest tighten. Trent McCarthy remained in custody, he said, and they were now able to confirm 2 names connected to the case. Only one had been verified through DNA at that time, but both were considered potential victims. He glanced down at a piece of paper in front of him, and for a brief second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The first name came out clearly, cutting through the air with a finality that made it impossible to misunderstand. The second followed, and the moment it was spoken, something inside me gave way. Lizzie H. Monroe. The words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over again, refusing to settle into anything that resembled acceptance. The chief continued speaking, mentioning that personal items belonging to both women had been found buried in the backyard, that there was a connection to a conference in La Jolla, California, that the investigation was still active. But his voice had already begun to fade for me, the details blurring into a distant hum as the reality of what had just been said took hold. Lizzie's name had been spoken in the same breath as the word victim, and there was no undoing that. He finished with a request for anyone with information to come forward, emphasizing once again that there would be no questions. This time, his tone left no room for argument, no opening for the reporters gathered around him. He turned and walked away from the podium, leaving behind a space filled with unanswered questions and the kind of silence that follows, something irreversible. The stream lingered for a moment longer before cutting away, but none of us moved. I felt it then, a darkness rising from somewhere deep, pressing against the back of my eyes, threatening to spill over in a way I couldn't stop. Nora let out a scream, sharp and sudden, the sound slicing through the room and shattering whatever fragile composure we had been holding on to. Someone else groaned, a low, broken sound that seemed to carry everything we were all feeling but couldn't put into words. Around me, people shifted, some stepping back, others leaning forward, hands covering mouths, eyes wide, each reaction different, but all rooted in the same disbelief. This couldn't possibly be real life, could it? The thought repeated in my mind, louder each time, as if asking it often enough might change the answer. The newsroom, the screens, the people around me. Everything suddenly felt distant, like I was looking at it through glass. Just hours ago, we had been trying to piece together fragments of a situation that didn't make sense, clinging to the possibility that there was an explanation we hadn't found yet. Now the explanation had been handed to us, cold and unyielding, and it was worse than anything we had imagined. I stood there without realizing I had moved, my body acting on its own, carrying me a step back from the desk as if distance might make it easier to breathe. The lights in the room seemed too bright, the hum of equipment too loud, every sensation amplified in a way that made it hard to stay grounded. Around me, the newsroom was no longer functioning as a workplace, but as a space where reality had cracked open, exposing something none of us were prepared to face. And in that moment, surrounded by people who understood the gravity of it all better than anyone else, I felt completely, overwhelmingly alone. Chapter 25, Olivia. 1 week after. The flight. In my mailbox sat a padded envelope that hadn't been there the day before, its presence quiet but somehow charged. as if it carried something more than just paper and tape. There was no return address, only my name written in a hurried hand that felt familiar without immediately placing why. I turned it over, noticing the Atlanta postmark stamped in dark ink, and something inside me tightened before I even opened it. The hallway around me was still, the faint hum of distant traffic slipping through the walls, and for a moment I just stood there holding it, as if delaying what was inside might delay whatever it meant. I tore it open carefully, the padded lining splitting with a soft, gritty sound, and slid my fingers inside. When I pulled out the contents, my breath caught in my throat. Cash. A thick stack of it, folded neatly, unmistakable in its weight and texture. $500, just like that, sitting in my hand as if it had appeared out of thin air. And in that instant, I knew exactly where it had come from. Chanel. A strange mixture of relief and disbelief washed over me, the realization settling in layers rather than all at once. She had come through, just like she said she would, even after everything, even with the chaos that always seemed to follow her. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the money as if it might disappear if I blinked too hard. How she had managed to get that much, I had no idea, but it didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was that she had kept her word, and something about that felt grounding in a way I hadn't expected. I tucked the cash into a drawer in my room, pushing it toward the back where it would stay safe until I could deposit it. The drawer slid shut with a soft click, sealing the moment away, at least temporarily. I pulled out my phone and sent her a quick message, a simple thank you that felt insufficient but was all I could manage. I watched the screen for a few seconds, waiting for the familiar dots that would signal a reply. Nothing came. It was my day off, and for once, I had planned to actually enjoy it. I settled onto the couch, stretching out with a sigh that felt like it had been building for days, maybe weeks. My body was heavy with exhaustion, the kind that didn't come from just physical effort, but from carrying too much for too long. I opened TikTok and began scrolling, letting the endless stream of videos wash over me, their brightness and humor a welcome distraction. For a while, it worked, the noise filling the quiet spaces in my mind where worry usually lived. Then my phone rang. Editor. His name flashed across the screen, and my thumb hovered over the answer button, caught in a moment of hesitation that stretched longer than it should have. I knew what he might want, knew the pattern well enough to predict it without needing to hear his voice. Someone probably called out. Someone needed covering, and he was going down the list of people he could rely on. Normally, I would have answered without question, but not today. Today I felt spent, drained in a way that made even the idea of standing behind the bar again feel impossible. I let the call ring out. A few minutes later, it rang again, more insistent this time, as if the phone itself were urging me to reconsider. I stared at it, the screen lighting up the room in pulses, and felt a flicker of irritation rise beneath the fatigue. I ignored it again, then reached over and switched the ringer off completely, flipping the phone face down on the table. I needed space. I deserved it. I couldn't keep showing up for everyone else when I had nothing left to give. With the phone silenced, I turned to Netflix, searching for something, anything, that could pull me out of my own head. I found a series I hadn't seen before and hit play, letting the opening scene unfold as I sank deeper into the couch. The characters moved through their lives with clarity and purpose, their problems neatly contained within the edges of the screen. For the first time all day, I felt a small measure of calm, a brief pause in the constant tension that had been following me. When the first episode ended, I stretched and stood, heading to the kitchen to make popcorn for the next one. The familiar routine was comforting, the sound of kernels hitting the pot and beginning to pop, filling the space with a steady rhythm. I leaned against the counter, listening as the popping grew louder, faster, until it became a chaotic burst of sound that echoed through the room. It felt almost alive, that noise, filling the silence I had been trying so hard to escape. While the popcorn finished, I walked back to the couch and picked up my phone, flipping it over again without thinking much of it. The screen lit up instantly, and my stomach dropped. 12 texts, 10 missed calls, all from people at the bar. My body went rigid, every muscle tightening at once as a wave of dread surged through me. Something was wrong. Something had happened. I opened the messages with shaking hands, my eyes scanning the screen, too. Quickly at first to fully process what I was reading. Then I slowed down, forcing myself to focus on one message at a time. Ed's text stood out immediately. "Have you been watching the news? Something happened to Chanel in Atlanta, of all places. Call me. Where the hell are you?" The words blurred for a second, my vision narrowing as my mind struggled to catch up. The news? What did he mean? The news. I scrolled through the other messages, each one echoing the same urgency, the same confusion, the same fear. My heart began to pound, loud and uneven, as I glanced at the clock and realized it was between the 6 and 10 o'clock broadcasts. The news. I hit Ed's number and pressed the phone to my ear, barely noticing that I was already standing. He answered immediately, his voice sharp with relief and something darker beneath it. "Jesus Christ, Olivia, where have you been?" he said, not waiting for me to respond. "This is bad. Really bad. Sit down." "Are you sitting down?" "No," I said, my voice thin and distant to my own ears. "What are you talking about, Ed? Just tell me what happened to Chanel." There was a pause, brief but heavy, as if he was gathering the words he didn't want to say. I could hear him take a breath, slow and deliberate, before he spoke again. "Police in Atlanta just held a press conference," he said, his tone softer now, but no less serious. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but Chanel is dead, killed by some guy down there that she met." The world tilted. I was aware of movement beside me, the soft thump of Rocky jumping off the couch and coming to my side, his presence immediate and instinctive. But everything else seemed to fall away, the room shrinking into something distant and unreal. The words didn't fit. Together, didn't make sense, didn't belong in the same sentence as Chanel. "Ed," I said, though it came out more like a whisper, "what did you just say?" He explained as best he could, filling in the details with what he knew, what others had said, what had been reported. He mentioned Lily, said she already knew, said they were closing the bar early and that everyone was gathering to talk, to grieve, to try to make sense of it. His voice continued, but it felt like it was coming from somewhere far away, reaching me through layers of disbelief and shock. When the call ended, I didn't remember saying goodbye. I sank to the floor beside Rocky, my knees giving out without warning, my body folding in on itself. I buried my face in his soft fur, gripping him tightly as if he could hold me together. He responded in the only way he knew how, licking my hand gently, his warmth grounding me in a way nothing else could. The tears came suddenly, without restraint, spilling over as the reality began to push through the numbness. "Oh, Chanel," I whispered, the words breaking apart as they left my mouth. How could this happen? My mind raced backward, replaying every message she had sent me, every moment we had shared. I remembered the first text, the one where she said she felt safe and beautiful, her excitement spilling through the screen in a way that had made me smile. Then I remembered the last one, the shift in tone, the mention of Trent, how she had described him as attractive, but hinted at something beneath the surface. She had insisted she was okay, that she didn't need anything, that everything was fine. That was just a few days ago. A few days. My stomach twisted violently, and I pressed my forehead harder into Rocky's fur, as if I could hide from the thoughts forming in my mind. No, this wasn't fair. None of it was fair. The life she had lived, the struggles she had faced, the things she had endured. It had already been more than enough. Her mother, Paolo, everything she had fought through just to find some sense of stability. And now this. It was too much. I pulled back slightly, wiping at my face with the back of my hand, trying to breathe through the tightness in my chest. I needed to do something. I needed to help, even if it was too late. The thought came quickly, almost instinctively. I should tell the police what I knew. Maybe it would make a difference. Maybe it would fill in a gap. Maybe it would help them understand what had happened. But as quickly as the thought came, doubt followed. I looked at my phone, at the messages I had already deleted, the fragments of conversation that no longer existed in any visible form. Could they still retrieve them? Probably. There were always backups, traces, things hidden beneath the surface of the device. The idea of handing everything over, of opening that door, made something uneasy stir inside me. I reached for the phone anyway, my hand trembling as I searched for the number of the Madison police. The screen blurred slightly as I scrolled, my vision still unsteady. Then I stopped. No. What would I actually be telling them that they didn't already know? And if they looked too closely, if they started pulling threads that led back to me, to things I had done, to things I had been involved in, what then? Would I become part of the story in a way I couldn't control? Would I be putting myself and Rocky at risk? I lowered the phone slowly, the weight of the decision settling over me. I couldn't do it. Not like this. Not without knowing what it would mean. Instead, I told myself I would find other ways to honor her. A funeral, a memorial, keeping her memory alive in the ways that mattered, in the ways that felt safe. If anyone asked me about her, about the person I knew behind the bar, I would speak. I would tell them who she really was. But I couldn't risk everything on something that might not even help. I pulled Rocky closer, wrapping my arms around him as I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing with everything I had that this could all be undone, that I could wake up and find it had never happened, that she was still out there, still texting, still laughing, still living. But the questions wouldn't stop. What kind of man was Trent? He meets her, takes her to Atlanta, and within a week, she's gone, along with another woman. The speed of it, the brutality, the sheer impossibility of it all, it didn't add up in any way that made sense. Was he a serial killer? Someone who had done this before? Someone who would do it again? Had Chanel walked straight into something she never saw coming? Or was there more to it? In with promises she couldn't refuse? Chanel didn't have much money, not enough to just pick up and go like that. Maybe he had funded it, made it easy, made it feel like an opportunity instead of a risk. Maybe that was how she had been able to pay me back, the thought twisting into something dark and unsettling. I pressed my face into Rocky's fur again, trying to block out the images forming in my mind. Her last moments. What she must have felt. The fear, the confusion, the realization that something had gone terribly wrong. I didn't want to see it, didn't want to imagine it, but my mind refused to let it go. I hoped with a quiet, burning intensity that Trent would never know peace again, that whatever awaited him would be as merciless as what he had done. And as I sat there on the floor, holding on to the only comfort I had left, I realized that nothing would ever feel the same again. Chapter 26. Trent, the first day of the conference. A row of treadmills stretched along the far wall of the hotel gym, each one facing a bank of tall windows that revealed a view far less inspiring than the machines themselves. Beyond the glass sat a wide hospital parking lot, rows of cars lined up in dull symmetry, and beyond that, a strip of highway where headlights flickered in the early morning haze. A few palm trees stood scattered along the edge, thin and motionless, offering just enough suggestion of California to remind anyone looking that they weren't home. It was 6:30 a.m., and I had forced myself out of bed, despite the weight of travel still clinging to my body, determined to get my heart rate up before the conference began. My doctor's voice echoed faintly in the back of my mind as I stepped onto the treadmill and began to move, his warning about creeping blood pressure lingering like a quiet threat. I had made a promise to myself at the start of the year that I would lose weight, take better care of myself, and avoid becoming one of those men who let success at work come at the expense of everything else. It was only the third week of January, but I had been consistent so far, and there was no way I was going to let a conference derail that. The machine hummed beneath my feet as I picked up the pace, the rhythm of my steps steady and deliberate. Pearl Jam filled my ears through my headphones, the music loud enough to drown out everything else, as I focused on the burn building in my legs. Disoriented, but I had managed to shake most of it off by the time I reached the hotel. I had checked in by late afternoon, taken a moment to settle into the room, and then treated myself to a dinner that bordered on excessive. A massive New York strip, 2 double-baked potatoes loaded with everything, dessert, and a few cocktails at the bar afterward. It had been exactly what I needed. I had even met a few other news directors there, men from different cities who shared the same professional language, the same guarded humor, the same understanding of what the job required. We laughed, exchanged a few stories, and for a brief stretch of time I felt energized in a way I hadn't in weeks. There was something refreshing about being around people who operated in the same orbit, even if those orbits rarely intersected outside of events like this. Back home, we kept our distance from one another, careful not to share too much, always aware of the competitive nature of the business. But here, in a neutral space, the rules felt different, looser, as if we could step outside the constant calculation for a while. I found myself looking forward to meeting more of them, to seeing how they ran their operations, to gauging where I stood among them, and being newly single added another layer of anticipation, one I didn't bother to disguise from myself. As I increased the incline on the treadmill, my thoughts drifted toward the possibilities that came with a conference like this. There would be women here, plenty of them, professionals who were sharp, driven, and in some cases more than willing to blur the lines between work and something else. It had been too long since I had enjoyed a proper one-night encounter, too long since I had felt that particular kind of connection, fleeting as it might be. The idea of it lingered in my mind as I ran, the music pushing me forward, my body warming, my pulse steady and strong. Then, without warning, my thoughts snapped back to Katrina. One of the last things she had said before she left me resurfaced with a clarity that made my jaw tighten. She had told me I should give my wedding ring to the station because I was married to it, not to her, and the memory still irritated me more than I cared to admit. It wasn't fair, not the way she framed it, not the way she reduced everything I had done to something selfish. Yes, I worked long hours, but it wasn't just for me. It was for the family, for the life we had built, for the opportunities we were able to provide. I increased the speed on the treadmill, my fists clenching slightly as the frustration bubbled up. Would she have been able to afford private school for the kids, her shopping trips, her endless self-care days if I hadn't put in those hours? I doubted it. And now, despite everything, she would still receive child support, still have her own house, still benefit from the very work she had resented. The thought of her moving on, dating someone new while living off what I had built, made something bitter settle in my chest. We had our issues, sure, but I didn't see them as anything out of the ordinary. I might have stepped outside the marriage a few times, but who could realistically expect one person to remain faithful forever in a world full of temptation? It wasn't as if she had been perfect either. There had been fights, heated ones, moments where tempers flared and things escalated. I might have pushed her, but it wasn't like it had been some unforgivable act. She had threatened a restraining order at one point, but thankfully, she never followed through. Something like that could have destroyed everything I had worked for. The treadmill slowed as I adjusted the incline back down, my breathing steadying as I transitioned into a cool down. Cold play replaced Pearl. Jam in my ears, the softer sound matching the gradual easing of my pace. My thoughts drifted again, this time toward breakfast, toward the options waiting downstairs in the hotel restaurant. My secretary had suggested avocado toast, claiming it was something I should try while in California, but the idea didn't appeal to me in the slightest. Eggs, hash browns, toast, and bacon sounded far better, something substantial, something that would actually leave me satisfied. I stepped off the treadmill and grabbed a towel from a nearby stack, the fabric stiff and carrying a faint chemical scent. As I wiped the sweat from my face, I caught my reflection in the wall of mirrors. Opposite the windows, I paused for a moment, turning slightly. Assessing what I saw, there was some extra weight around my midsection, more than I liked, but the rest of me held up well. My arms were toned, my face still carried a youthful edge, and my hair remained one of my strongest assets. Back in my room, the shower was as luxurious as the rest of the hotel, a rainforest head combined with side jets that sprayed from multiple angles. The water was hot and steady, washing away the sweat and the lingering stiffness from the flight. The scent of eucalyptus from the body wash filled the small space, sharp and clean, leaving me feeling refreshed as I stepped out and wrapped a towel around my waist. Standing in front of the large bathroom mirror, I took another moment to look at myself, this time with a bit more satisfaction. I went through my grooming routine with practiced precision, shaving carefully, trimming where needed, making sure everything was exactly as it should be. Every detail mattered, especially in an environment like this where first impressions carried weight. I briefly considered checking in with my assistant back in Atlanta, just to make sure everything was running smoothly, but dismissed the idea almost immediately. This was my time, my break, and I wasn't going to let the day-to-day operations pull me back in. Instead, I turned on ESPN, letting the familiar cadence of sports commentary fill the room as I dressed. My clothes were already prepared, pressed and organized in travel bags, a small luxury made possible by my assistant. I chose a monogram suit coat, pairing it with a Ralph Lauren V-neck, pressed slacks, and polished Hugo Boss shoes. A quick touch of gel to my hair, a glance at my watch, and I was ready. Breakfast was exactly what I expected, solid if not exceptional. The eggs were slightly overdone, but the hash browns were crisp, the bacon was good, and the coffee was strong. I drank it black the way I always had, the way my father had insisted was the only proper way to drink it. By the time I finished, I felt energized, focused, ready to step into the day. The ballroom buzzed with activity as I entered, the air filled with conversation, the low hum of networking already underway. A table near the entrance held name tags, and a young woman stood behind it, offering assistance. She asked if I needed help finding mine, and I responded with confidence, giving my name and watching as she searched through the tags. When she handed it to me, I signed in with a bold flourish, making sure my presence was noted. The room beyond was filled with professionals dressed in muted tones, the uniform of the industry on full display. Conversations overlapped, handshakes were exchanged, introductions made. I found my assigned table and approached, noting the people already seated there. A tall black woman introduced herself as Dorothy, her voice deep and steady, her experience evident in the way she carried herself. Another man joined us shortly after, small and wiry, his demeanor suggesting a different kind of newsroom entirely. Then she arrived. She stood out immediately, her bright pink blazer cutting through the sea of neutral colors, her presence drawing attention without effort. Her dress revealed just enough, her posture confident, her expression composed. When she introduced herself as Lizzie Monroe, I felt a spark of interest that went beyond simple curiosity. She was easily the most attractive woman in the room, and I knew instantly that she would be my focus for the conference. We settled into our seats as the session began, the speakers launching into presentations filled with data and strategies. Dorothy and the other man took notes diligently, while Lizzie and I remained more relaxed, our attention drifting in and out. When it came time to discuss our own approaches, I took the lead, outlining my philosophy with certainty. Strong leadership, decisive action, a focus on what drew viewers. Those were the principles I stood by. The others shared their perspectives, each one different, each one shaped by their own experiences. Dorothy spoke of community engagement, of deeper storytelling, while the other man emphasized collaboration and inclusivity. When Lizzie spoke, her answer was less defined, more general, but there was something about her that held my attention anyway. And as she excused herself to step away, I watched her go, already planning how I would approach her next. Chapter 27. Trent. After lunch, the conference ballroom was overwhelmingly male, the kind of ratio that didn't need to be announced because it was obvious the moment you stepped into the room. I took a quiet sort of satisfaction in that, scanning the rows of men in tailored jackets and pressed shirts, each one carrying himself with the same unspoken confidence that came from years of being in charge. There was a certain order to it, a structure that made sense to me, and I found myself nodding slightly as I settled into my seat, as though confirming something I had always believed. Outwardly, of course, I would never say it, not in a room like this, not in a time like this, but the thought sat comfortably in the back of my mind all the same. I leaned back and glanced at the afternoon program, flipping the glossy page with a lack of enthusiasm I didn't bother to hide from myself. More speakers, more panels, more drawn-out discussions filled with the same recycled language dressed up to sound meaningful. One panel in particular caught my eye, something about mental health in the newsroom, and I couldn't help but roll my eyes slightly. The phrase itself felt vague, overused, like something people said when they didn't have anything concrete to offer. Life had its ups and downs, that was the reality, and dressing it up with terminology didn't change that. As the minutes ticked by and the room filled with the low hum of conversation, my attention began to wander. I started to map out an exit in my head, a quiet escape that wouldn't draw too much attention but would free me from the monotony of the afternoon. San Diego was just outside those doors, full of possibilities, and the idea of slipping away early grew more appealing with each passing second. I imagined calling an Uber, heading somewhere lively, ordering a drink, maybe two, and letting the day unfold on my own terms. And, if I played it right, I could convince Lizzie to join me. That thought sharpened my focus immediately, and I straightened slightly, scanning the room for any sign of her. The bright pink blazer she had worn earlier had made her easy to spot, a splash of color in a sea of muted tones, but now there was no trace of it anywhere. My gaze moved from one cluster of people to another, lingering for a moment on every figure that might match her silhouette, but she was nowhere to be found. Instead, I spotted Dorothy and Alan making their way toward our table, deep in conversation, their heads tilted toward each other, as if they had already formed some kind of alliance. I watched them approach, noting the way Dorothy gestured with her hands while Alan nodded along, his posture attentive and slightly deferential. They had sat together at lunch, too, I remembered, their connection forming quickly in a way that felt predictable. I had avoided their table deliberately, maneuvering instead to sit beside Lizzie, sliding into the available seat before anyone else could claim it. It had been a small victory, one that felt almost strategic, and I was confident I had made some progress with her during that time. Our conversation at lunch had been easy enough, a back and forth that gave me just enough information to start building a picture. She had gone to DePaul, she said, and was originally from Indiana, details I stored away without much thought. She had a son, Andre, which I noted but didn't dwell on, choosing instead to focus on what wasn't present. No ring, no mention of a partner. That told me everything I needed to know, or at least everything I chose to believe. I had shared bits of my own story in return, framing my recent divorce in a way that cast me in the best possible light. I spoke about the financial strain, the imbalance, the sense that I had been taken advantage of, all of it delivered with just enough frustration to feel real. At one point, as we stood for a group photo, I had moved closer to her, letting my body press lightly against hers in a way that was subtle but deliberate. It was a test, a small signal, and when she didn't pull away, I took it as confirmation that I was on the right track. "Hi, Trent. Did you enjoy your lunch?" Dorothy's voice pulled me back into the present as she reached the table and took her seat. Alan followed without a word, settling in beside her with a quiet efficiency that matched his overall demeanor. I responded politely, mentioning the chicken Lizzie and I had both ordered, then returned the question out of habit more than interest. They spoke about the fish, describing it with a level of enthusiasm that felt excessive given the circumstances. Dorothy leaned forward slightly, her expression bright with anticipation as she mentioned the afternoon sessions. She spoke about the importance of the topics, particularly the discussion on mental health, framing it as something essential for any newsroom. I gave a non-committal response, a low sound that acknowledged her words without engaging with them. My attention had already drifted again, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of Lizzie. She hadn't come back in with the rest of us after lunch, I realized, and the absence was starting to feel noticeable. The MC was already making her way to the stage, preparing to kick off the next segment, and still there was no sign of her. I felt a flicker of irritation, a sense that something wasn't going according to the loose plan I had started to form in my head. Had she switched tables? The thought annoyed me more than it should have, and I found myself glancing around again, searching for any indication that she had simply relocated. The session began, but I paid little. Attention to the speaker, my focus divided between the stage and the growing list of possibilities running through my mind. Maybe she wasn't feeling well, I considered, though that seemed unlikely given how fine she had been at lunch. We had eaten the same meal after all, and I felt perfectly normal. Food poisoning didn't hit that quickly, did it? Or maybe she had received a call, something urgent from back home that required her attention. Another possibility surfaced, one that carried a mix of annoyance and admiration. What if she had simply decided to leave, walked out of the conference entirely because she found it as dull as I did? The idea frustrated me, mostly because I hadn't done it first, because I was. Still sitting there listening to the same drawn-out presentations while she might be somewhere far more interesting. But at the same time, it impressed me. It took a certain boldness to make that kind of decision, to disregard expectations and follow your own instincts. The thought lingered, growing into something more appealing with each passing minute. Maybe we were more alike than I had initially assumed. Maybe she understood the value of stepping away, of choosing something better over something expected. I imagined us leaving together, finding a spot by the pool, drinks in hand, the conference fading into the background as something irrelevant. When the MC announced a short break, the room came alive with movement, chairs scraping against the floor as people stood and stretched, voices rising in a collective murmur. This was my opportunity. I had no intention of sitting through another 90 minutes of what felt like filler. Not when there were better ways to spend my time. Dorothy and Alan had already turned to speak with others, their attention completely elsewhere, and I took that as my cue. I grabbed my messenger bag from the back of the chair and headed for the exit without a second thought. The hallway outside felt cooler, quieter, the hum of the ballroom fading behind me as I made my way to the elevators. The idea of heading back to my room, maybe catching a bit of the pool, turning on the TV, relaxing with a drink. All of it felt like exactly what I needed. I pressed the button and waited, the seconds stretching just long enough for me to feel the shift from obligation to freedom. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and I stepped inside, riding up to my floor in silence. When the doors parted again, I moved down the hallway toward my room, my pace unhurried now, my mind already settling into the idea of the afternoon ahead. A maintenance worker stood a couple of doors down, knocking and announcing himself, his voice carrying just enough to catch my attention. I was about to swipe my key card when I heard it, her voice. I paused, my hand hovering near the reader, and turned slightly, listening as the conversation continued. She told the worker everything was fine, that whatever issue had been reported was no longer a problem. He offered to come in and check, mentioning something about ice and medication, but she declined, her tone polite but firm. I stayed where I was, just out of sight, absorbing every word. So that was it, I thought. She had left because of something in her room, something minor, something already resolved. The realization felt almost satisfying, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. And now, with both of us away from the conference, the situation presented itself as an opportunity. I waited until the maintenance worker disappeared into the elevator, then turned toward her door. I smoothed my hair, checked my breath, adjusted my posture, all small movements designed to present the best version of myself. For a moment I stood there, listening, but the room beyond was quiet, no sound of movement or conversation. I knocked lightly at first, then again with more intention. "Lizzie, it's Trent," I called, keeping my voice friendly, easy. "You okay?" There was a pause, a faint rustle from inside. Then the door opened just a crack. Her eyes appeared first, framed by slightly smudged eyeliner, her expression tired but alert. The room behind her was dim, the curtains drawn, the light kept out. I leaned casually against the door frame, offering a smile meant to reassure, to engage. She explained she had a migraine, her voice softer now, and the pieces fit together in a way that made sense. I offered help, joked about being handy, anything to keep the conversation going. When she tried to close the door, I stopped it gently, suggesting a drink, a break from the conference, something to ease the tension. She resisted at first, citing the headache, but I pressed just enough, not too much, keeping the tone light. Finally, I reached into my pocket and handed her my key card, the gesture casual but deliberate. "If you feel better, come by," I said, adding a smile that I knew worked. "No need to knock." She hesitated, then took it, and just like that, the door opened a little wider, both literally and in a way that mattered far more. Chapter 28. Trent at the conference. When I got back from the pool, the late afternoon sun still clung to my skin, leaving behind a faint warmth that lingered as I stepped into the cool, dim quiet of my hotel room. I tossed my key onto the desk and glanced toward the door, half expecting to see it open at any second, to find Lizzie standing there with that same composed look she had worn earlier. But the room remained still, the silence stretching longer than I liked, settling into something heavier with each passing minute. I dropped onto the king-size bed, the mattress absorbing my weight as I stretched out, one arm draped over my chest, the television murmuring softly in the background. Golf played on the screen, the hushed voices of the announcers drifting through the room in calm, measured tones that contrasted sharply with the restless energy building inside me. I watched without really seeing, my mind circling back to the same thought over and over again. She had taken the key. She had said she might come. That had to mean something. Time slipped by in small increments, the light in the room gradually dimming as the sun lowered, and eventually my eyes closed without warning, sleep overtaking me in a shallow, uneasy way. When I woke, the room had changed, shadows stretching across the walls as the day gave way to evening. For a moment I lay there disoriented, the soft hum of the television still filling the space, before the realization settled back in. Cocktail hour. I pushed myself up onto my elbows and looked toward the door again, half expecting something different this time. Nothing. No Lizzie. Just the same stillness, the same absence that now felt deliberate. A flicker of frustration ran through me, sharp and immediate, the anticipation I had carried all afternoon turning into something tight and uncomfortable. I had been looking forward to this, to the easy flirtation, the possibility of something more, something that would break up the monotony of the conference and give the trip a different kind of energy. Now, that energy had nowhere to go, and I felt it sitting in me, unresolved, like a pressure I couldn't ignore. I stood and moved into the bathroom, the bright overhead light forcing me to squint slightly as I leaned against the counter. The mirror reflected a version of me that still looked put together, still confident, still in control, but I could feel the edge beneath it, the impatience that had started to creep in. I turned on the faucet, letting the water run for a moment, then shut it off, my thoughts drifting into a more physical space as I tried to release some of that tension. Afterward, I wiped my hands on one of the hotel towels and dropped it carelessly to the floor, adding it to the small pile that had already begun to form. The room would be cleaned later, the details handled by someone else, and I didn't give it another thought. Instead, I focused on getting ready, pulling on a crisp collared shirt with my initials stitched neatly into the cuff. The fabric cool and smooth against my skin. I tucked a handkerchief into the pocket, adjusted it just enough to look deliberate without trying too hard, and slipped into my best jeans and polished shoes. By the time I stepped out into the hallway, I had regained my composure, the earlier frustration tucked away beneath a layer of practiced ease. The elevator ride down was quick, the doors opening to a lobby that buzzed with the low hum of conversation and movement. Outside, near the outdoor fireplace, clusters of people had already gathered, drinks in hand, plates of small bites balanced casually as they moved from one conversation to another. The air carried the scent of grilled, appetizers, wine, and something faintly smoky from the fire, creating an atmosphere that felt almost relaxed, almost inviting. I scanned the crowd immediately, my eyes moving from one group to another, searching for that flash of pink, for any sign of her. But she wasn't there, not near the fireplace, not by the bar, not lingering at the edges of the gathering. The absence hit harder this time, sharper, more defined, and I felt a brief moment of disappointment that I quickly smoothed over. Instead, I did what I always did. I adapted. I stepped into a nearby group, offering a greeting that was warm, confident, easy to receive. Conversations opened up quickly, introductions exchanged, laughter following not long after. The rhythm came back to me without effort, the familiar flow of networking, of connecting, of positioning myself in a way that felt both natural and deliberate. It worked the way it always did, and before long, I found myself part of a small group that carried its energy beyond the conference grounds. We moved together through the evening, leaving the hotel behind for dinner in Little Italy, where the streets were alive with light and sound, restaurants spilling over with people, music drifting out from open doors, plates of pasta, glasses of wine, conversations that grew, louder and looser as the night unfolded. It all blended into something that felt vibrant and alive. From there, we went to a club, the shift in atmosphere immediate, the bass of the music vibrating through the floor, lights cutting through the darkness in sharp, pulsing patterns. There were 5 of us by the time the night reached its peak, a group I quickly dubbed the Power Players, a name that earned a few laughs and a handful of raised glasses. It was easy to slip into that role, to lean into the confidence, the sense that we were somehow set apart from the rest of the conference, more interesting, more engaged, more alive. Dorothy and Alan weren't part of it, of course, and I didn't give them a second thought as we moved from one moment to the next. By the time I made it back to the hotel, the night had stretched well beyond what I had planned, the alcohol settling into my system in a way that made everything feel slightly off balance. Sleep came quickly, heavy and unstructured, and when morning arrived, it did so without mercy. Friday. Day 2. I pushed the curtains back and immediately recoiled, the bright California sun cutting into my eyes, like something physical. I turned my head away, rubbing my temples as a dull ache spread across my forehead, settling into something that pulsed with each heartbeat. My throat felt dry, my body sluggish, every movement requiring more effort than it should have. The idea of stepping onto a treadmill was out of the question, not today. For a moment, I considered skipping the conference entirely, letting the day pass from the comfort of the bed. But I had already missed part of it the day before, and there was something else pulling me forward now. Lizzie. She had to be back. She had to be feeling better. I moved through my routine more slowly than usual, letting the hot water of the shower run longer than necessary as I tried to shake off the lingering effects of the night before. The steam filled the bathroom, wrapping around me, easing some of the tension in my muscles, though not enough to fully clear my head. I shaved carefully, dressed with less precision than the day before, and headed downstairs with just enough time to grab something quick. The continental breakfast offered pastries and coffee, and I took both without hesitation, the sugar and caffeine exactly what my body seemed to crave. It wasn't ideal, not part of the plan I had set for myself, but today wasn't about discipline. It was about getting through. Inside the ballroom, the setup had changed, name cards arranged to guide us into new groupings. I found my seat among unfamiliar faces, noting the absence of the previous day's table without much concern. Dorothy and Alan were somewhere else in the room, easy enough to spot, but Lizzie's seat remained empty, her name card sitting untouched in front of a chair that no one had claimed. I glanced over more than once, trying to keep it subtle, trying not to make it obvious that I was looking for her. Maybe she was running late. Maybe she was still recovering. Maybe she would walk in at any moment, slide into that chair, and pick up right where we had left off. But she didn't. The hours passed, the sessions blending together, the speakers talking while my attention drifted in and out. Each time I looked over, the chair remained empty, the absence becoming more noticeable, more defined, until it was impossible to ignore. A small edge of irritation began to build again, sharper this time, less forgiving. She had told me she would be back, that a day of rest would fix everything. And yet here I was, pushing through the discomfort, showing up, doing what was expected, while she had simply disappeared. By the afternoon break, something in me had settled into a different kind of certainty. I was done with her. Whatever promise I thought had been there, whatever potential I had imagined, it no longer mattered. I turned my attention elsewhere, toward the woman from the night before, the one who had matched my energy, who had leaned into the moment without hesitation. There were other options, other possibilities, and I wasn't about to waste time on someone who couldn't even show up. And just like that, Lizzie Monroe slipped from my focus, her absence replaced by something new, something easier, something that didn't require waiting. Chapter 29. Trent. After the conference, I got home later than I had planned that Saturday, the kind of late that makes the body feel heavier than it should, as if the hours themselves had added weight to my shoulders. The flight had been long, the airport crowded, and by the time I stepped out into the humid Atlanta air, I'd seriously considered calling it a night and going straight home. But as I drove past the familiar streets of my neighborhood, the low glow of the bar at the corner caught my eye, its warm light spilling out onto the sidewalk like an invitation. I slowed without really thinking about it, pulled over and told myself I'd just go in for a couple of nightcaps before heading home. The place had been there longer than almost anything else in the area, a relic from another era that had somehow survived as everything around it modernized and rose up into sleek condos and apartment buildings. Inside, the lighting was dim, the kind of soft amber glow that made everything feel just a little less sharp, a little more forgiving. The walls carried the weight of decades, dark wood, worn smooth in places, and the faint scent of old liquor and polished surfaces hung in the air. I liked it that way. It felt grounded, real, a place where time didn't move quite as fast. I slid onto a stool at the end of the bar, near the door, and ordered a gin and tonic. Something simple, something that wouldn't demand too much thought. The glass was cool in my hand as I took a slow sip, letting the quiet settle around me. Conversations drifted from nearby tables, laughter rising and falling in waves. But I remained on the edge of it all, content to sit alone for a while. My body was tired, my mind still catching up from the trip, and the drink helped smooth the edges, just enough. Then the door opened, and everything shifted. A woman stepped inside, pausing just long enough to take in the room before moving forward. She wore a top that left little to the imagination, the kind of outfit designed to draw attention without needing to try too hard. My eyes followed her automatically, a slow, deliberate glance that started at her feet and worked its way up, a familiar gesture that had served as an opening line more times than I could count. She caught it immediately, her lips curving into a knowing smile as she made her way toward me. "Hey," she said, her voice light, easy, as she reached the empty stool beside me. "Is this seat taken?" I shook my head, already leaning slightly in her direction, and she slid into place as if she had always intended to be there. Up close, she was even more striking, her energy filling the small space between us in a way that felt both effortless and deliberate. She introduced herself as Chanel, her tone carrying a hint of playfulness that made it clear she knew exactly what she was doing. We started talking, the conversation flowing easily, her hand brushing my arm now and then, her leg occasionally grazing mine as she shifted on the stool. There was something about her, something that made the moment feel charged, like it could turn into something more at any second. I found myself leaning into it, responding in kind, matching her energy, letting the interaction build naturally. After a while, I excused myself and headed to the bathroom, my mind already a few steps ahead of where we were. I reached into my pocket, took what I needed, and gave myself a small nod in the mirror before heading back out. When I returned, she was still there, exactly where I had left her, her posture relaxed but her attention sharp. We picked up right where we had left off the conversation, deepening just enough to feel like something was forming. I was on the verge of inviting her back to my place, the words already forming in my mind, when she leaned back slightly and glanced toward the door. "I should probably head home," she said, her tone softening just enough to signal that the moment was about to end. I felt a flicker of disappointment, sharper than I expected, and leaned forward slightly. "Come on," I said, trying to keep it light. "Don't leave yet." She smiled, but there was a firmness behind it now. "I really do have to go," she said, her hand resting briefly on my arm. "But give me your number. I'll call you." Something about the way she said it made me hesitate, a small instinct that suggested I should ask for hers instead, that I should keep the balance in my favor. "You give me yours," I replied, watching her closely. She shook her head, still smiling. "No, I'll call you," she said. "I promise. In fact, I'll text you a picture when I get home, something you won't forget." That got my attention. I handed over my number, the decision made in that moment, and watched as she slipped off the stool and headed toward the door. The air seemed to shift again as she left, the space beside me suddenly empty, in a way that felt more noticeable than it should have. I finished my drink, paid my tab, and made my way home, the walk slightly unsteady, the night settling into me in layers. By the time I reached my place, exhaustion had taken over completely. I barely made it to the bed before collapsing onto it, still fully dressed, the room spinning just enough to blur the edges of everything. Sleep came quickly, deep and heavy, pulling me under without resistance. I woke briefly around 6 in the morning, the need to use the bathroom dragging me back to consciousness. The light in the room was pale and thin, the early hours pressing in through the blinds. I grabbed my phone, blinking against the brightness of the screen, and checked for any messages. Nothing. No text, no picture. I felt a brief flash of irritation, but it faded quickly, replaced by the lingering fatigue that still weighed on me. I dropped the phone back onto the nightstand, stripped down to my boxers, and fell back into bed, letting sleep take me again without a second thought. When I woke for the second time, it was mid-morning, the clock reading just past 10. The day had already begun to unfold without me, and I stretched slowly, the events of the night before coming back in pieces. Sunday, playoff football. That was the plan. I had intended to hit the gym first, keep up with my routine, then meet up with a few friends at our usual sports bar, a place that had everything you could want on a game day. Multiple screens, endless food, drinks flowing, the kind of atmosphere that made it easy to lose track of time. But as I sat up in bed, something felt off. A sharp pain twisted through my stomach, sudden and intense, forcing a groan from deep in my chest. I doubled over instinctively, clutching at my gut as the discomfort spread, tightening, refusing to ease. Within seconds, I was on my feet, moving quickly toward the bathroom, barely making it in time. What the hell? I never got sick, not like this. The episode left me drained, my body weak in a way I wasn't used to, and I barely had the strength to make it back to the bed. I lay there, for a moment, breathing slowly, trying to convince myself it would pass. "I'll sleep it off," I muttered, pressing my face into the pillow. "Then I'll meet the guys." Sleep came quickly again, pulling me under before I could think any further. When I woke next, the light in the room had changed again, the sun higher, the day well underway. I reached for my phone, squinting at the screen, and saw that it was already 3 in the afternoon. I had missed the first game entirely. 5 texts from my friends lit up the screen, each one asking where I was, what had happened, why I hadn't shown up, and still no message from Chanel. "Well, great," I muttered, dropping the phone back onto the bed. The pain in my stomach had dulled but hadn't disappeared, settling into a persistent ache that refused to fully let go. I moved slowly from the bed to the couch, each step measured, and turned on the second game with a sense of frustration that sat just beneath the surface. Who gets sick on a Sunday like this? I thought, picturing my friends at the bar, laughing, drinking, fully immersed in the day I had missed. The rest of the day passed in a blur of discomfort and restlessness. I barely ate, made more trips to the bathroom than I cared to count, and found myself drifting in and out of sleep on the couch. By the evening, I considered calling in sick for the next day, the thought lingering just long enough to make me uncomfortable. I didn't take sick days. That was part of who I was. But when Monday morning came, it brought with it a pounding headache, a dry throat, and a reflection in the mirror that looked worse than I felt. My eyes were bloodshot, my face pale, and for the first time in years, I considered the possibility that I might actually need to stay home. The idea didn't sit well with me. Weakness wasn't something I tolerated, not in myself, not in anyone else. But as I stood there, staring at my own reflection, I knew I didn't have much of a choice. Reaching for my phone, I made the call, the words feeling foreign as I explained that I had caught something, that I needed time to recover. Even as I said it, I hated it. But the body doesn't always ask for permission. And for once, I had no choice but to listen. Chapter 30. Trent, Tuesday overnight. I was deep in sleep when the pounding started, the kind of heavy, relentless noise that doesn't belong in dreams and doesn't quite make sense at first. It took nearly a full minute for my mind to surface, for awareness to claw its way through the fog of exhaustion and confusion. My eyes opened slowly, unfocused, blinking against the darkness as I turned my head toward the clock on the nightstand, trying to make sense of the numbers glowing faintly in the dim light. The sound came again, louder this time, unmistakable now. Something solid striking wood with urgency that refused to be ignored. "What the hell is going on?" I muttered, my voice thick with sleep, as I pushed myself upright, rubbing at my eyes with the heel of my hand. The room felt disjointed, as if I had been pulled too quickly from one state into another, my thoughts lagging behind my body. Then I saw it. The flickering reflection of red and blue light dancing across the wall, bleeding through the curtains in uneven bursts. Outside, a dog barked somewhere nearby, sharp and persistent, its agitation cutting through the silence like a warning. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet hitting the cool floor as the pounding continued, now accompanied by the faint echo of voices I couldn't quite make out. My heart began to beat faster, not from fear yet, but from confusion, the kind that comes when nothing fits together the way it should. I grabbed the robe hanging from the chair, pulling it on quickly over my boxers, the fabric barely tied as I moved toward the door. The house felt different, unfamiliar in that moment, every step echoing just a little too loudly as I crossed the living room. When I opened the door, the scene hit me all at once. 2 officers stood there, their presence filling the doorway before I had time to process anything else. One was a white woman with her hair pulled tightly into a bun, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. The other, a black man, stood slightly forward, his stance wide, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. Before I could speak, before I could even form a question, he barked out an order that cut through everything else. "Hands up and come out the door." The words landed hard, leaving no room for interpretation, no space to argue or hesitate. My hands rose almost automatically, my body responding before my mind could catch up, the movement slow and unsteady as I stepped forward. I was still waking up, still trying to understand what was happening, but something in his tone told me this wasn't a situation I could talk my way through, at least not yet. The moment I crossed the threshold, the officer moved in, his hands quick and firm as he turned me around. I felt his grip on my arms, the pressure as he pulled them behind my back, the cold snap of metal as the handcuffs clicked into place around my wrists. The sound was sharp, final, echoing in a way that made my stomach drop. I opened my mouth, finally finding my voice, though it came out thinner than I expected. "Officer, I haven't done anything." It didn't even sound like me. The words felt foreign, high-pitched, almost fragile, and the realization sent a strange shiver through me. The officer didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge what I had said. "Stop talking," he said instead, his voice flat, before turning to his partner. "Take him to the squad car. We'll look around." Before I could react, before I could push back or demand answers, more movement erupted around me. Tires screeched somewhere close, the sudden arrival of additional vehicles breaking through the quiet of the neighborhood. Door slammed, heavy and urgent, and I watched as more officers spilled out, their footsteps pounding against the pavement and then onto my property. The sound carried into the house as they moved inside, boots hitting the hardwood floors in a way that made my jaw tighten. "There's nothing here," I said, my voice louder now, edged with frustration. "I didn't do anything." But no one responded. It was as if my words didn't exist, as if I were speaking into a void that refused to answer back. The female officer took hold of my arm, her grip steady, but not unnecessarily rough, and guided me toward the squad car. She didn't say anything, didn't look at me as she opened the back door and lowered my head just enough to keep it from hitting the frame. The gesture was almost considerate, almost human, and for a brief moment, it stood in stark contrast to everything else that was happening. I slid into the back seat, the vinyl cold against my bare legs, the door shutting with a heavy, final sound that seemed to seal me inside a reality I still couldn't fully grasp. I sat there, my hands bound behind me, the robe barely covering me, and stared out at my house. The flashing lights painted everything in alternating shades of red and blue, turning the familiar into something distorted, something unrecognizable. I tried to make sense of it, to piece together a scenario that would explain why I was sitting in the back of a police car in the middle of the night. It didn't add up. None of it did. This had to be a mistake, another misunderstanding like the one earlier, something that would be cleared up quickly once someone realized the error. The thought settled in, firm and reassuring, and I clung to it as the only explanation that made any sense. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more certain I became. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a massive one. Someone was going to answer for this, and when they did, it wouldn't be quietly handled. I could already see the headlines, the investigation, the scrutiny that would follow. I could put my team on it, dig into the details, expose whatever had gone wrong. That thought almost made me smile. Around me, the neighborhood was waking up, lights flickering on in nearby houses as curious faces began to appear behind windows and curtains. I could feel their eyes, the weight of their attention, and a flicker of irritation ran through me. This was going to be awkward to explain later, but I would handle it. I would make sure they understood that this was a mistake, that I was completely innocent, that the real issue lay somewhere within the department that had decided to bring this chaos to my doorstep. Minutes passed, stretching longer than they should have, each one filled with the sounds of movement, of voices, of something unfolding just out of my reach. More cars arrived, more officers stepped in and out of my house, and I watched it all with a growing sense of disbelief. One of them carried a notebook, another a camera, their presence suggesting something more serious than a simple misunderstanding. What were they even looking for? The thought lingered, unanswered, as I shifted slightly in the seat, the handcuffs biting into my wrists with the movement. This was absurd. Me, sitting here like this, treated like some kind of criminal. The idea felt so far removed from reality that it almost seemed laughable. I should sue them, I thought suddenly. The idea forming quickly, taking hold. I could make a case out of this, turn it into something that worked in my favor. Maybe this wasn't entirely a bad thing. The thought took on a life of its own, expanding, twisting into something almost appealing. A lawsuit, a settlement, a payout large enough to change things, to simplify things. I could pay off Katrina, remove that constant pressure, maybe even step away from everything for a while. The Bahamas came to mind, the image of clear water and open space replacing the flashing lights and tension of the moment. The door opened abruptly, pulling me back. The male officer stood there, his expression set, his presence heavier now, more defined. I straightened slightly, expecting something different this time, expecting the shift from confrontation to correction. This was the moment where it would be resolved, where the apology would come, where everything would fall back into place. Instead, he grabbed my arm and yanked me out of the car, the movement rough enough to jolt me fully awake. "What the hell?" I snapped, the frustration finally breaking through. "Watch it and take these off." "That won't be happening," he said, his voice steady, his eyes locked onto mine in a way that made something cold settle in my chest. "Do you want to explain why a woman's phone, wallet, and jewelry were buried in your backyard?" The words didn't register at first. Space between us, waiting for my mind to catch up. "A woman?" I repeated, the question barely forming as my thoughts scrambled to find something, anything, that made sense. What woman? My mind raced, flipping through possibilities, each one more unlikely than the last. Someone who had lived here before me? Some kind of mix-up with addresses? It had to be something like that. It had to be. The officer reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open with practiced ease. He glanced down at it, then back up, at me, his expression unchanged. "Name is Lizzie Monroe," he said. "Does that ring a bell?" The world seemed to tilt. "What?" I choked out, the word catching in my throat as everything inside me froze. And in that moment, for the first time since the pounding had started, I felt something shift deep within me. Not confusion, not irritation, but something far worse, something that refused to be ignored.